Destroy Media Narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:07 p.m. in Budapest. 3:07 p.m. on the east coast of the United States. And then it's nice lunchtime on the west coast. I've given up with the Australia-New Zealand thing because I just got too confused. And whenever I try to do that, I always manage to offend somebody in Australia or New Zealand because I always got it wrong. But anyway, welcome everybody who has joined me. I really appreciate it. So, you know, the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, is in the United States. And he's been, holding news conferences with Biden, with Blinken, and the rest of them. And let me see if I can show you something from. He gave a talk at the Wilson Center the other day, and let's see if I can find this. So this, it's never that easy to do. Let's see. No, that's not it. Maybe I can see if I can. Oh, this could be it. Yes. So here is some. Here's Stoltenberg, and he's giving this talk at the Wilson Center, and then he's asked a question by this guy, Ambassador Philip Rieker. He said, I'm the chair of the Global European Program here at the Wilson Center. Oh, Ambassador. Now, those of us of an older generation will remember Ambassador Philip Rieker from the days of the bombing of the Serbs. He was the State Department spokesman at the time. They've all done very nicely for themselves. Anyway, those Kosovo alumni, and Philip Rieker says here, I want to show you here. He says, here we are. I want to start by going to your first point. Deterrence and defense are the essential role that NATO plays in that for the United States, because I think sometimes this is lost in the broader American public. Now, as leaders gather next month and mark the 75th anniversary, it's important to remember that from its founding in 1949, NATO has been and remains very much to this day a defensive alliance. So this is Ambassador Philip Rieker. This is the absolute bullshit that the U.S. government and the rest of that crowd peddles. And he says 32 allies, including the United States, now have taken over a series of decades and generations, have taken independent and sovereign decisions, often backed by national referenda, to become members of the organization committed to common defense. Now, you have to then say, well, what's wrong with this picture? Well, what's wrong with this picture is that there were never any referenda anywhere. I don't like saying referenda. It always sounds very, very pompous and pretentious. I know it's supposed to be the rule in English. If it's a word that ends and it's a plural, and you say sorry, there's a word. It's not ultimatum. It's ultimata. Well, that sounds ridiculous. I always say ultimatums, and I say referendums, because then you have the most ridiculous part is when you have forum. Well, I'm not going to say forums. I'm going to say fora. What is fora? Well, who the hell says fora? Anyway, so I always say uz. Anyway, ultimate referendums, and there were never any referendums on NATO membership. The only time there was a referendum was in 1997 in the case of Hungary, and they didn't get a quorum. Not a quota, a quorum. They didn't get a quorum. In other words, not enough people actually bothered to show up to vote. So in theory, the Hungarian induction into NATO should not have gone ahead. But it did go ahead. And so that was the first and last time they tried to have a referendum, because it's very, very embarrassing when you have a referendum and no one shows up, because basically the public really has no interest whatever in joining NATO. So this is a lie put about by NATO, the somehow referendum. In fact, the most recent cases, they went out of their way to not to have referendums. For instance, in Sweden and Finland, absolutely no referendum, no referendum. And the funniest of all was in the case of Macedonia, when what they were trying to do in Macedonia, they thought they were being very cute, is that they would have a referendum on the name change. So they changed it to North Macedonia. They couldn't really get Macedonia into NATO because Greece said, well, you can't go around calling yourself Macedonia because Macedonia is Greece. So you can't do it. We're not gonna accept you. So they said, okay, well, the only way we can get you into NATO is if you change your name and you stop calling yourself Macedonia. And I mean, before that, they used to, again, in order to get around the Greece objection, they used to call themselves the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. So it was FYROM. It was called FYROM. But then because they ended the, Marty says, just announced Noam Chomsky has died. Oh, that's really, that's too bad. So I'm very sorry to hear that. Thanks, Marty, for letting us know. That's really sad news. But he was in his 90s, and so that's very, very sad. Okay. So anyway, yeah, no, that's disappointing, but unfortunately, as there's that line from Citizen Kane. Last week, as it must to all men, death came to Charles Foster Kane. So today, as it must to all men, death came to Noam Chomsky. So very, very sad to hear it. But anyway, in the case of Macedonia, they decided, okay, we'll call it North Macedonia. Once you can get that in, then they could get Macedonia into NATO. So they had, okay, well, let's have a referendum on the name change. Well, again, not enough people showed up, but even though not enough people showed up to the referendum, what NATO did is say, yeah, okay, that's fine, that's fine, right? Okay, no problem there. The name change goes ahead, and North Macedonia is hereby inducted into NATO. They pulled a similar stunt in the case of Montenegro. They said, hey, well, let's have a referendum on Montenegro. They knew, of course, they would lose the referendum. So they said, no, we can't have a referendum, because if we had a referendum, Russia would interfere. And so they kind of created these ridiculous, bogus stories about how there was a Russian attempt to create a coup. Russia was trying to overthrow Djukanovic, all sorts of idiotic plots. But by doing that, by creating that story, they could avoid having a referendum on Montenegro's induction into NATO. So there it was. So that's how they got into Montenegro. There's always a way to avoid a referendum, because you always know you're going to lose the referendum on NATO membership. Yeah, so Takfiri Hunter. No, so Timofey Abrikosov. Oh, that's good. We got a Russian name here. Timofey Abrikosov says, let me, because I like that. I give a 100% guarantee that if there was a referendum on NATO membership in Ukraine now, or a few years ago, the population would vote against it. Well, I don't know how they would vote today, but we do know that back in 2008, 2009, when NATO issued its invitation at the Bucharest summit for NATO membership for Ukraine, they had polls by pollsters took them, and he was overwhelmingly opposed to NATO membership. So that was Ukraine. There was no desire, whatever. So when NATO issued its invitation in April 2008 at the Bucharest summit, there was absolutely no desire on Ukraine's part to join NATO. Now, admittedly, it would be a little different now because, of course, if you had a referendum now, all of the people who live in eastern and southeastern Ukraine wouldn't take part, so the vote might go the other way. But that was the only outcome. That was back in 2008, 2009, 2010. There was absolutely no desire on Ukraine's part to join NATO. So anyway, let me just go back then to this Wilson Center thing, and so he says this thing about the defensive alliance, or this lie, and then he says, what I want to ask you, that he says this to Stoltenberg. What I want to ask you about is Vladimir Putin, the authoritarian leader of Russia. While he has changed his narrative and justification for his war against Ukraine over the past 2.5 years, and of course, since he invaded Crimea in 2014, he continues to point to NATO, and particularly Ukraine's aspiration of membership in NATO, as threatening to Russia. So give him credit. He's actually doing more than any of these sycophantic, disgusting sacks of potatoes, otherwise known as journalists, who show up at these NATO press conferences or State Department press conferences, who never actually ask this question. So he continues to point to NATO, and particularly Ukraine's aspiration of membership in NATO, as threatening to Russia. Why do you think Vladimir Putin has been successful, certainly in his own country and increasingly in other parts of the world, in painting NATO as an aggressor with offensive intentions against Russia, when it is so clearly defined in its basic roots for 75 years as a defensive structure and organization? So again, let's think about this. This is Philip Rieker. This is the guy, he was the State Department scumbag at the time of the bombing in 1999 of Yugoslavia. So he knows perfectly well that NATO is not a defensive organization, that NATO is there's been bombing countries for years, that NATO expansion by definition cannot be defensive. If you're defensive, you stay put. You defend what you have. You don't keep expanding and don't keep moving to the borders of other countries particularly that you deem to be your adversaries, as NATO deems Russia to be. So that he phrases it. And then Stoltenberg, he's a kind of a glad hander, and then he says, I want to just say this. That was it fine. So yeah, it says Stoltenberg says Russia is authoritarian countries where journalists are put in jail and opposition leaders are poisoned and killed. Yeah, well, I mean, not unlike the West, where you have journalists are put in jail, people are deplatformed. The police come knocking on your door, and you get thrown in jail. And of course, one doesn't even have to bring up the case of Julian Assange. Or you got leaders of the opposition, as in the case of Donald Trump. You bring criminal charges against them, threaten them with 700 years in prison, and so on. So of course he controls the media in a way that makes it hard in a way to convey any different story than the official story. Just as it's hard in official Western media to get a sense of the different story. I mean, we do it here at the Gaggle, and other people, of course, also um, present an alternative story. But it's not easy to break into the put out a different story to the mainstream media. And then he says, but more important is that NATO is a defensive alliance, and it's absolutely wrong, this idea that Ukraine was a threat to Russia. Ukraine has never been a threat to Russia. The whole thing started with Russia annexing Crimea back in 2014, after Russia actually signed different documents, agreements, after the end of the Cold War, recognizing Ukraine as a sovereign independent state, including the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine was actually one of the largest nuclear powers in the world after the end of the Soviet Union. They agreed to give up all those weapons, but in return, Russia recognized Ukraine within its international recognized borders. Now, everything he says there is a lie, because as we've discussed many times on the Gaggle, that's not what the Budapest Memorandum was about. Ukraine was not, has never been a nuclear power. It did not have a nuclear stockpile. Those were nuclear weapons stationed in Ukraine when Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. They were under Soviet command and control. Russia, as the legal inheritor of the Soviet Union, retained command and control of those nuclear weapons. They did not belong to Ukraine. Just because they were in Ukrainian territory didn't mean that they ever belonged to Ukraine. Ukraine never had control of those nuclear weapons. It's like saying, I mean, there are nuclear weapons throughout Europe. They are American nuclear weapons. They are short-range American nuclear weapons. And in Belgium, in Italy, in Germany, and they are under American control. It's like saying Belgium is a nuclear power. It's like saying Turkey, there are nuclear weapons in Turkey. It's like saying Turkey is a nuclear power. It's absolutely idiotic. And this is being said over and over and over again. Oh, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Ukraine never gave up anything. And it was that this was a complete nonsense. Now, if he's going to start talking about pledges that were made at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, well, one pledge that was made, and this was a crucial pledge, was that Ukraine would be non-aligned. Non-aligned. That's what it says. It was in its declaration of independence. Ukraine would not join any military alliances. That was in its pledge of allegiance. So if you're going to talk about that, if you're going to bring up what happened at the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, then it was that Ukraine was non-aligned. That was the pledge it made. It would not join any military alliances. And the Budapest Memorandum never had any provisos in there about any military pledges, any military undertakings, or anything like that. That again is a lie, by suggesting that somehow some commitments were made to Ukraine. No one who attended that meeting in Budapest in '94 understood it as leading to military commitments. So this is a familiar lie constantly put about, that somehow Russia made any pledges or anything of the sort. The demand that these nuclear weapons be removed from Ukraine was certainly a demand made by Russia, but above all, it was a demand made by the United States. The United States, where you got to say, move these nuclear weapons out of Ukraine and out of Kazakhstan, because of course there was also nuclear weapons stationed in Kazakhstan. And so this agreement in the Budapest Memorandum concerned the removal of nuclear weapons from Ukraine and from Belarus and from Kazakhstan. And they will all move to Russia because Russia was the legal successor state to the Soviet Union. These were Soviet nuclear weapons. They're not Ukraine nuclear weapons. They're not Kazakhstan nuclear weapons. So this is the Stoltenberg, who's the NATO Secretary General, is just talking absolute balls here. I mean, and it's a disgrace that he goes here to the Woodrow Wilson Center, and he gives this talk, and he's just saying there's something that is an utter lie. Now, the reason why I bring up Stoltenberg, other than he's just something that his very existence irks me so much. I mean, there's something, I find it hard to live in a world in which Stoltenberg is also living. I mean, it's just hard to take. You go there, you go out, you have a meal, have a drink, have a nice whiskey, and then you think to yourself, yeah, but Stoltenberg is also in this world. He's also part of this world. And that gives you a very strange feeling. I mean, like, however much you may be feeling, that was a nice glass of whiskey. You think, yeah, but Stoltenberg is part of this world as well. So anyway, he visited Budapest last week, and we talked a little bit about that. He talked, with Orban, and let me see if I can I let's see if I can find this. This was the where are we? Yeah, that's that. Yeah, let's see if I can find this. So this was this is he came to Budapest, and what he did was essentially to give the green light from Viktor Orban for NATO's preparation for war in Ukraine. And here's Stoltenberg again, says, for 75 years, NATO has been the ultimate guarantor of security for our members, providing peace, freedom, and prosperity in the whole of Europe, not least in the countries of the former Warsaw Pact. So these are the countries of the former Warsaw Pact who are now being pushed into a war. At least in the days of the Warsaw Pact, they were left alone, do whatever you want to do, just don't make trouble. Now they're being pushed into a war, but apparently they're being told that, hey, you're a guarantor, we're the guarantors of your security. And then he says, Prime Minister, so he's addressing Orban at this joint presser, you and I also discussed the situation in Ukraine. At the summit, I expect allies will agree a leading role for NATO in coordinating and providing security assistance and training for Ukraine. So notice here, a leading role for NATO in coordinating and providing security assistance and training for Ukraine. I also expect allies will agree long-term financial pledge to provide military support. This will provide the predictability and accountability that Ukraine needs. Now, just pause a little bit there, because NATO, which is a defensive alliance, it has its North Atlantic Charter. We talked about that, the North Atlantic Charter, which makes clear in its Article 1 that every member state of NATO resolves to resolve any disputes it may have with any non-NATO member state by exclusively peaceful means. In other words, there's an obligation that, so in other words, rather than just simply repeat in this, in this zombie-like way, NATO's a defensive alliance, NATO's a defensive alliance. It actually says there in Article 1 that no NATO member state may have a conflict with any non-NATO member state that it does not pledge to resolve peacefully. And that the NATO play, the whole business of one for all for one, only applies if a NATO member state comes under attack. So if a NATO member state pledge to resolve all issues peacefully, then clearly, if there is armed conflict, it will be as a result of somebody launching an attack on a NATO member state. And then you can say, yeah, well, we're defensive. So when Stoltenberg says here, let's read that again. Stoltenberg says here, at the summit, I expect allies will agree a leading role for NATO in coordinating and providing security assistance and training for Ukraine. I also expect allies will agree long-term financial pledge to provide military support. In other words, he's saying NATO is going to be the leading force in providing military support for Ukraine. Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Ukraine is involved in a war with another state that is not a member of NATO. Russia poses no threat whatever to any NATO member state. And yet Stoltenberg is saying, as Secretary General, that he is pushing all 32 NATO member states into this conflict in Ukraine, a non-NATO member state, against Russia in other non-NATO member states. That, he goes in and he says it's a clear violation of the North Atlantic Charter. And for somebody like Orban, who supposedly is the man of peace, who has been getting a lot of favorable publicity for talking sensibly. Sensible is a relative term, but certainly more sensibly than everyone else in NATO. He's saying, well, this is so we're essentially violating our charter, and yet we're going to go on repeating, this mantra that we're a defensive alliance. How are you a defensive alliance if you're involved in this war in Ukraine? How can you be a defensive? You're outside your area. So then he goes on. Prime Minister Orban has made it clear that Hungary will not participate in these NATO efforts. And I accept this position. And I'm glad that today the Prime Minister and I have agreed on modalities for Hungary's non-participation in NATO support to Ukraine. No Hungarian personnel will take part in these activities, and no Hungarian funds will be used to support them. At the same time, the Prime Minister has assured me that Hungary will not oppose these efforts, enabling other allies to move forward, and he has confirmed that Hungary will continue to meet all of its NATO commitments in full. Now, the one thing, first of all, one thing that's interesting in the way that he has formulated it, he says that no Hungarian personnel will take part in these activities. No Hungarian funds will be used to support them. Now, the issue of the funds is interesting. I mean, money is fungible. I mean, if you use money for one thing, basically that means it frees up money for something else. So well, we won't use Hungarian money. How do you know you're not using Hungarian money? So I don't really understand that. I mean, and in any case, Hungary is a part of the EU. The EU gives money to Ukraine, so that Hungary is obviously providing money to Ukraine. But there's something else that's interesting. He says no Hungarian personnel will be used in these in the operations in Ukraine, and that's it. Now, there was something else that Orban used to say, which was, if people recall, not only that no Hungarian personnel will be used, presumably when he talked about in this war, but he also said no Hungarian territory will not be used to transit NATO arms, weaponry, ammunition to Ukraine. Now that is missing from this modalities that Stoltenberg outlines. Now, Orban, who kind of talks about being a peace, he wants peace, he wants peace. At this stage, could easily have said, well, we can't really take part in this war that you're waging, because if we are members of NATO, as member state of NATO, we are part of a military alliance that what you're saying is that this military alliance is effectively now at war with Russia. It's going to be fighting a war with Russia in Ukraine. And we, Hungarians, with our experience of the two world wars, when we were dragged into wars that were started by others, and we got thumped in two wars. We really got thumped. I mean, World War I was the biggest thumping, but it got a bit of a thumping after World War II as well. We were pushed into it by others. We're not going to be pushed into it again. This is what Orban said. He said this 2 weeks ago. We did a couple of podcasts on that. So Stoltenberg comes to Budapest and just gets this agreement with Orban and says, well, we're not going to do anything to stop NATO. Now, remember, again, Hungary could easily say, look, we don't agree with this policy. We are henceforth suspending our membership. We're not leaving the military alliance, we're just suspending our membership. Until this issue in Ukraine is resolved, we are suspending our membership. Because we're heading towards war. And if there is a war, we really don't think that Russia is going to start making all sorts of calculations about who and what kind of agreements they signed with Stoltenberg. They're going to say we have to hit military targets, and so therefore we're going to hit Hungary. Hungary is a target-rich country. There's lots of military bases in Hungary, lots of air bases in Hungary. So if there's a war between NATO and Russia, Hungary will be a target-rich environment. So therefore, your only remedy is, look, we're just going to get out of this. We're suspending our membership. So that didn't happen. Now today, there was a further development. And let me now show this further development. So this further development, let me go to this, is that Viktor Orban sent out a tweet. He says, following the recent European elections where Hungarians voted in huge numbers in favor of peace, we reached an important agreement with NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg. Let me see just if I can do this slideshow. Play from current slide. We reached an important agreement with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, which we just talked about. We agreed that no Hungarian personnel will take part in the activities of NATO in Ukraine, and no Hungarian funds will be used to support them. Our next step this week was to ensure that this agreement can stand the test of time. Ooh, test of time. After yesterday's meeting in Brussels, Prime Minister Mark Rutte Prime Minister Mark Rutte confirmed that he fully supports this deal and will continue to do so, should he become the next Secretary General of NATO. In light of his pledge, Hungary is ready to support Prime Minister Rutte's bid for NATO Secretary General. Minister President also assured me that his aim as NATO Secretary General will be to treat all allies with the same level of understanding and respect. Now, keep in mind, Rutte had about a couple of years ago called for Hungary to be kicked out of the European Union. He was, Dutch Prime Minister, and it was this that irked the Hungarians and said, "Oh, we can't possibly support Mark Rutte as NATO Secretary General because he said Hungary should be kicked out of the European Union." But you can see Orban has abandoned that position. If you recall, Orban had raised an issue about Sweden. You remember there was an issue about Sweden being allowed to join NATO. We had these wonderfully unprincipled positions taken by Turkey and Hungary, not, the natural question which sovereign states should ask, like, does Sweden's membership in NATO, does that enhance Europe's security? Are we safer if Sweden is in NATO than if Sweden stayed out? Instead of asking that question, Turkey raised the issue that apparently there were all kinds of Kurdish activists active in Sweden, and Sweden refuses to crack down on them. And that somehow, there are all sorts of anti-Islamist manifestations in Sweden. That was Turkey's position on the question of whether Sweden should be in NATO. Hungary also raised an issue about Sweden's membership. But Hungary said, Sweden's going around criticizing Hungary. They're criticizing democracy in Hungary. Well, we don't really like it. They're saying Hungary is not democratic. We don't like that. And Sweden has joined this lawsuit against, a number of states joined this lawsuit against Hungary, that somehow Hungary was denying LGBTQ plus rights, and Sweden was a plaintiff in this lawsuit. And so, we don't like that. So we're going to, wait a little bit on signing off on Sweden joining NATO. So there was a little bit of argy-bargy, and Orban said, well, if you want us to agree to Sweden joining NATO, why doesn't the Swedish Prime Minister, kind of a really nerdy-looking guy, not unlike Mark Rutte, why doesn't he come to Budapest and meet with me and some of my colleagues, and let's thrash this out, over drinks or whatever. And a Swedish Prime Minister said, nah, I don't think so. I'll come to Hungary when Hungary agrees to Sweden's membership in NATO. And Hungary duly agreed. Sweden made no concessions whatsoever. All of this was just posturing, and Sweden duly, Hungary lifted its objections, just like Turkey lifted its objections. Sweden didn't make any concessions, and Sweden got in, and I guess the Swedish Prime Minister duly made his visit to Budapest. So now Mark Rutte, who had said Hungary should be kicked out of the EU, apparently Hungary has lifted its objections to his becoming NATO Secretary General, because he said he's going to stick to the agreement that was signed with Stoltenberg. Remember what this, again, none of that means anything, because if there's a war between NATO and Russia, Hungary will be in the front line. You know, you can say we're not going to send any personnel. Big deal. As for the money, money is fungible. As long as you're in NATO, you're funding everything NATO does. So here was this. Wow, this is really small. I'm not even sure that I can read this, but this is the letter Mark Rutte wrote to Orban. Notice the dear Victor. You put Victor. It says, "Dear Victor." God, this is small. Following our previous conversations and contact between our advisors, I would like to confirm the following in writing. Oh, in writing. Hungary has been a valued NATO ally for 25 years. Hungary hosts important military headquarters and supports stability in the Western Balkans, including with a significant contribution of troops deployed in Kosovo with the KFOR peacekeeping mission. So that's Kosovo, that's NATO, which stole this territory from Serbia. Hungary apparently takes part in this operation. Notice also what he says. Hungary hosts important military headquarters. Yeah, exactly. So if there's a war, that's a target-rich environment. Then he says, furthermore, since the beginning of Russia's brutal war of aggression against Ukraine, Hungary has provided shelter to many thousands of Ukrainian refugees and helped with rehabilitation of wounded soldiers. I am aware of the outcome of the talks between Stoltenberg and you regarding NATO support for Ukraine. It is my understanding that you stressed that no Hungarian personnel will take part in these activities and no Hungarian funds will be used to support them. At the same time, you assured Jens Stoltenberg that Hungary will not oppose those efforts enabling other allies to move forward. You also confirm that Hungary will continue to meet all of its NATO commitments in full. In a possible future capacity as NATO Secretary General, I will fully support this outcome of the talks between Jens Stoltenberg and you. Notice I put it, it is my understanding that you stressed that no Hungarian personnel. That doesn't sound like he accepts Orban's terms. He says, I understand you stress this. Okay, you stressed it. And that's good. Some people like to stress one thing, other people like to stress something else. So good to go. I will fully support the outcome of the talks between Jens Stoltenberg and you. As discussed, I also took note of some remarks I made in 2021 as Prime Minister of the Netherlands have caused dissatisfaction in Hungary. That's the let's kick Hungary out of the EU comments. My priority in a possible future capacity as NATO Secretary General will be to maintain unity and treat allies with the same level of understanding and respect. All right. Notice how he hasn't withdrawn. He hasn't withdrawn any of those those comments that Hungary should be kicked out of the EU. Just say, yeah, I understand. Some people are unhappy about it. Yeah, well, there it is. That's a lot of people are unhappy about a lot of different things. So that's that. So over the past few months, we had Orban, who, remember, he was going to march into Brussels, just before one of the big EU summits, and he wasn't going to accept the start of EU accession talks with Ukraine, and then he went out, get a cup of coffee, and just as he was out the door, the EU voted, okay, should we start the accession talks with Ukraine? Yep, let's start. Okay. And Orban returns with coffee in his hands. Oh, did you take the vote? Damn, I missed it. So that was that. And then in return, There was the you got 10 billion 10 billion euros that Hungary received, and then of course there was the 50 billion euros that the EU sent to Ukraine. Again, he was going to object, and he was going to raise all sorts of issues. He withdrew, of course, all these objections and said, "Yeah, okay." And then the EU gave him some nonsensical quid pro quo. They would do. Oh yeah, it was a deal. And then he and his clowns on Twitter, this Zoltan Kovac, who's his spokesman, said, "Oh, Hungary has asserted its sovereignty. Hungary is, is an independent, sovereign country." And I guess some people believe that sort of thing. And so now we have this. He's withdrawn his objections to Mark Rutte as NATO Secretary General, and again, all of these statements by Stoltenberg, by Orban, by Rutte, none of them state with the position that Orban had staked out early on, which was that you cannot use Hungarian territory to transfer arms into Ukraine. That's gone. So evidently that Hungarian territory will be used to transfer arms to Ukraine. So that's now. I find it very difficult to understand what's the purpose of somebody like Viktor Orban. I mean, he's obviously celebrated by these conservatives in the United States because he talks this conservative claptrap, and I say it's claptrap because it's banalities. Families, children, work. Well, who's against all of that? I mean, the left, the liberals, they're against families, they're against children. Well, Ursula von der Leyen is, one of seven children. Her father had, her parents had 7 children. And she herself has given birth to 7 children. So I don't think Ursula von der Leyen, however detestable she is anti-children. They all come along with this banalities. Giorgia Meloni, oh yeah, children, children of the future. We want to have more children. Well, you're not going to have more children. There are all sorts of reasons why there aren't going to be more children. There are not going to be any more children in Hungary. There are not going to be any more children in Italy or Russia or anywhere else in our world. Until a lot of things change, and they're unlikely to change anytime soon. So all this is just a lot of hooey. We're going to have lots of children. So he's been embraced by the conservatives as this. Hungary is a work culture. Oh, we have work culture. Actually, it's true that there isn't really much welfare in Hungary, but it's not exactly a work culture. I mean, it's not, and people don't exactly break a sweat working here. I mean, it's just and that's fine. I mean, I never demand that everybody works. I mean, people live the way they want to live, but the idea of claiming that Hungary is a kind of work culture is just laughable. But what baffles me is, he's going to go. The next election is 2026 in Hungary, and he's going to do his usual shtick of campaigning against Brussels, and he's going to take on. Probably Ursula von der Leyen will be president of the EU Commission, and he's gonna, shake his fist at Brussels. But none of it ever really amounts to anything. He never does actually anything. I mean, he always backs down. I mean, he's just, whipping up this fervor, and then he's going to back down. But sooner or later, you think Hungarians will figure out, well, why should we vote for him when we would have the same result with the opposition, and without the aggravation. So there's, they've got the new great white hope in Hungary, this Peter Magyar. New York Times did a fawning profile of him the other day. I talked about him before. Complete zero, as most of these Hungarian politicians are. But as a Hungarian, you think, well, look, he will pursue essentially the same policies as Orban, but he's not going to, antagonize the EU as much as Orban. So, we'll probably be better off. We might get some of that 20 billion back. I mean, that 20 billion that the EU has frozen. They might give it to Peter Magyar. So, I mean, it's like, why support someone who actually doesn't do anything? I mean, all you get is this completely pointless antagonism. And incidentally, Orban's promise of reviving Hungarian football, well, that's a dud as well. Hungary got absolutely slaughtered the other day by Switzerland in the European Nations Cup. Probably Hungary will be defeated tomorrow by Germany, and that'll be the end of Hungary's European ambitions. And particularly, as a lot of people here were quite excited and expecting Hungary to do rather well. Anyway, let me address some of the comments and people have made. And Danuki. Yours there, George, saw your funny Hungary NATO agreement tweet. Well, yeah, thank you. I talk about this now at great length. Yes, indeed, I guess Dodik will proclaim the secession of Republika Srpska about the same time as Orban will run into the first line of trenches holding his agreement piece of paper. And also about the same time, Russia will take Odessa, Kiev, and Lvov concurrently. You have a way of presenting issues, Danaki. I can't quibble with anything you say. It's the people, Orban and Dodik, they're marvelous at getting people very riled up, and that they're not actually going to do anything. I mean, at least when you get Vucic, who always has this lugubrious manner. I mean, Vucic just said, "Oh, we're just a little country. We don't matter in this world. We don't control anything. We can't do anything. It's quite hopeless if you're a tiny country like we are. We're just trying to get by." I mean, it's pathetic, contemptible, and despicable in many ways, but at least he's being honest. And incidentally, one has to say, look, it's always very hard to call on anyone else to be brave, but there are others who are brave and who risk their lives and suffer greatly for things that they believe in, against people they deem to be their enemies. You have to say this about the Palestinians. I mean, the Palestinians get a very, the media hate them, but you have to, these people for 75 years, they've been absolutely getting slaughtered, and they haven't given up. I mean, you think, look, these are not people who give up. However hopeless it is, however much the odds are against them, they don't sit there feeling sorry for themselves like the sort of 7'6" tall Alexander Vucic. He's not actually 7'6". He just looks like he's 7'6". So yeah. But Russia will take Odessa, Kiev, and Lvov concurrently. So then Cynthia So welcome, Cynthia. Always good to see you. Thank you for your excellent commentary yesterday for the on the mouse that roared. George, you're right. The mouse that roared never was done in black and white, but many movie stills from it were done in black and white. Huh, I wonder why. Which is probably why many people, including myself, were misled into believing that this film was originally done in black and white. Anyway, here's one example of one of those black and white movie stills in the film. Okay. That was, yeah, Peter Sellers. I mean, it's very funny because in every movie, he kind of, he looks like, the Jewish guy from the East End, which is what Peter Sellers was. He was a Jewish guy from the East End. But he's got some beautiful movie star that he's playing opposite, whom, he, eventually gets. And I think Sellers himself had all sorts of insecurities, and he was always trying to get these movie stars in real life. So again, when you see that picture of him with Gene Seberg, and he gets Gene Seberg in the end, Sellers was kind of like that. He went after Sophia Loren, and pretty much all of the glamorous stars that he played opposite. And then Cynthia goes on, you may also find it interesting that the film was made into a TV pilot in 1966. I didn't know that. Though it's never been aired, it stars Sid Caesar and was directed by Jack Arnold, who also directed the feature film, which isn't all that surprising since by that time, most of what he directed was for TV shows, not for feature-length films. I wonder why didn't it make it as a TV pilot? Why, I'd have thought, you could easily turn it into a sitcom. It's the kind of sitcoms they used to make in the 60s. I can see why that they could do that. And then Cynthia provides us with a link to that pilot. I'm going to take a look. Dale Owens, good to see you, Dale. Says George, a Reform UK candidate, got into hot water last week for saying Britain should have stayed neutral in World War II. What do you think? Does he not have a not unreasonable point? Yeah, that's right. I mean, the thing was that, of course, it's been a kind of the an unexpressed sentiment in Europe that Britain on the eve of World War II, 1938, 1939, was, as Neville Chamberlain said at the time, we are a rich but vulnerable empire. If we get into another war, we're going to lose the empire. I mean, he said this. I mean, Churchill was, would do this and would do that, but Churchill had no idea of how Britain was going to fight this war against Germany. I mean, Chamberlain actually thought about this. Well, we are a rich but vulnerable empire, and we're going to lose all of that if we get into a war. And he, tried to keep Britain out of the war, and of course, he failed. Largely, by a combination of Churchill and the Labour Party, which also became very, very anti-Hitler. And again, the issue isn't really Hitler. I mean, Chamberlain had no time for Hitler, detested Hitler, the Nazis, and so on. But the question was, well, what's in the British national interest, which is all that a British Prime Minister has to ask, what's in the British national interest? And fighting another war against Germany, particularly as Britain really had very few allies in 1939, other than France, and Chamberlain knew right away that there's no way that France was going to withstand Germany. The France was completely demoralized. France would never be able to fight against Germany. So Britain was pretty much alone. The Americans were not getting in, and so the only possible ally is the Soviet Union. And for most people in Britain, including Neville Chamberlain and including Churchill, the Soviet Union is worse than Nazi Germany because they're communists. They're the worst. They're horrible scumbags. The worst people in the world are the communists. They were insane Jews. That's how they saw them. They were just these demented Jews who wanted to cut everybody's heads off. So they thought, we're not going to align ourselves with the communists of the Soviet Union. So, Britain, by going to war, became a complete dependency of the United States. It was obvious that would happen. There was no other way you can do it because Britain just simply didn't have the resources to fight against Germany and became a complete dependency of the United States. And of course, after the war, it obviously had liquidated its empire. And as the labor, as the price that labor exacted for joining that government, which again, it was a part of the government. There was no need to bring labor into that government, but labor was brought into the government, to the wartime government. They feathered their nests during the war. And then, of course, in 1945, they had this huge election victory and brought in their massive welfare state that Britain had no means to pay for. So, so Britain, and by the 1960s, empire was gone. Big welfare state needed to be paid for, which Britain really didn't have the resources, and we know about the rest. So when this guy, this Reform UK guy, said, it didn't really make much sense to get into that war, I mean, he was absolutely right. Of course, the argument should be extended. It didn't make much sense to get into World War One. I mean, there was no sense to get into World War One. There was not much sense in getting into a World War Two, and there's certainly no sense in getting into another war now against Russia. Now, as far as I know, Dale, this guy hasn't been kicked out of the Reform Party. I think he's still standing in that constituency. Because I heard that Reform had just simply distanced themselves from this guy, but they hadn't kicked him out and said, no, we can't possibly have him. But it wouldn't surprise me if they did. I mean, I never think Nigel Farage is going to stand in the way of, once the media is baying for blood, that, Farage isn't going to stand on the ramparts. Marty, thank you so much for your generosity. And Takfiri Hunter, I saw the Undertaker with his NATO chief holding the press. Yeah, God. Yeah. Blinken can't lie, right? The NATO chief looked like a fawn caught looking in the headlights, eyes wide shut. Denoki says Russia's ally Armenia plans to buy Caesar howitzers from NATO member France. Yeah. Another win for Putin. Yeah. No, I think so. It's yes. Amazing the number of diplomatic triumphs that Russia's winning. Cynthia brings up next week's film, The Candidate, 1972, was a very close runner-up in the movie poll last week. Surely you'll screen it here next Monday night. Yes, we definitely going to do it. Surely you won't break with your tradition of screening runner-ups at less the very close ones. No, we are going to do it. I mean, this was a close contest, and the Mouse That Roared won. It was a narrow win over the candidate. I was surprised actually that the Mouse That Roared won. I wasn't expecting it to win. I didn't think the candidate would win. I was predicting that Being There would win. So I was surprised that Being There didn't do that well. So I was expecting Being There to come in first, then the candidate. So I predicted the candidate would come in second, and then the Mouse That Roared. So anyway, Takfiri Santa, it's good you pointed out, George. Professor Mearsheimer said, if only Ukraine kept its nuclear weapons, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I mean, You're absolutely right. I'm amazed that Mearsheimer, who's supposed to be this realist professor, keeps peddling this nonsense about Ukraine giving up. The Ukraine shouldn't have given up its nuclear weapons. I mean, I don't know how he can talk such utter nonsense. As I said, Ukraine never had nuclear weapons. Ukraine was not a nuclear power. And Ukraine didn't have a choice. Ukraine could not hold on to its nuclear weapons. It would not have been permitted. If it tried, if it said, well, no, we're not going to give them back to Russia, Ukraine would have been invaded. The United States and Russia would have invaded Ukraine and physically picked up the missiles and taken them out. I mean, it was not something that was on offer. I mean, the issue was only, well, Ukraine had to be paid some compensation, just like Kazakhstan and Belarus had to be paid some compensation because somebody had to come in and pick them up and take them out. So I don't understand why they continue with this, with Mearsheimer of all people. I mean, I can understand Stoltenberg, but Mearsheimer, I don't get. Anyway, Dan Rock, thank you so much. You appreciate your generosity. It says, love your comment about Stoltenberg's existence. Yeah, it's a very strange phenomenon. That you kind of even at this very moment as we're talking, I think that in this world Jens Stoltenberg exists. It makes it very strange. I mean, I can understand a lot of things existing. I can understand the existence of hyenas and hippopotami, or whatever. But I don't understand that in this world there is such a creature as Stoltenberg. That's just beyond my understanding of God's will. Anyway, Cynthia says, apropos of the death of Chomsky, I heard that he suffered a massive stroke last week and was recovering in a hospital in his wife's native country of Brazil. Okay. And since his stroke was described as massive, I'm not at all surprised he died soon after his stroke. It's still very sad news. He was someone who's been around so long that it's hard to believe he'd ever die. No, that's exactly right. I mean, the last few times that he'd been recording interviews. I mean, he was obviously showing his age, but again, he's in his 90s, so there's nothing surprising about that. But he looked old. But you're right. I mean, he has been around so long. But if you look at his on YouTube, some of his when he was younger and very energetic and vibrant, just how good he was in debate. Particularly when the one time that Buckley had him on firing line, and you could just see the extent to which Buckley was wholly out of his depth in talking to Chomsky. I mean, it was just no contest. But yeah, I mean, you're right. It is sad. Anyway, so Danrock says Orban will bottle it. I'm not saying he doesn't have his reasons, but eventually he will go along with it. Yeah. I mean, it's just anyway. Takfiri says Professor Chomsky must be rolling in his grave already for his death being declared on deplorable Twitter, no matter how much information we get off that site. Zero reports on mainstream media. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there'll be the usual nonsense talked, such as, oh, he supported the Viet Cong, or that he defended the Khmer Rouge, or he denied the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge. I mean, all these ridiculous stories that there were the accusations that were made against him over the years. Oh, he defended the 9/11 terrorists and all this. I mean, it's all absolute nonsense. But that's what they'll say. That he was always on the side of the terrorists. He was always on the side of the Islamists. He was always on the side of the communists. So you get prepared for all of that rubbish. Danrock says Hungary will beat Scotland, but might not be worth anything. A bit like Orban's promises. I agree with you, but I don't think so, because the way it works is that you get the top two from all the groups go through. That's 6 groups, 12, and then the 4 top 3 finishers. But I don't think Hungary will be among the top 3 finishers. So it's so because they just won't have enough points, and probably the goal difference will not be good enough. So I have to say, I'm not even sure they'll beat Scotland. I don't know. It's just me. I mean, I'm just a kind of a pessimist, but I'm not at all sure they will beat Scotland. Takfiri says the news about Professor Chomsky has already been labeled as a hoax. Oh, really? Okay. Danrock says Vucic looks like he's 7'6" because he hangs out with Meloni, Macron, Sunak, and even Putin. I don't know. That's right. But he is very tall. He is a huge guy. But he has this whole lugubrious manner. He always, he never smiles. Other than a kind of a sad half smile. That's the best he can do. And he always looks like he's about to burst into tears. So if that interview that he gave, which I posted on the Gagglers board with a German reporter, he looked at any moment that he was just going to burst into tears. So that anyway. Stone River says, I'm not seeing any news of his death on the internet yet. Okay, thank you, Stone River, anyway, for very much of your generosity. Marty, I guess you're posting Greenwald. Greenwald has said it. Greenwald, I think, is pretty reliable. I mean, I'd have, if Greenwald is reporting it, then I believe it. And he's in Brazil. Greenwald is in Brazil, so so I'm sure that's right. And then Marty says Eduardo Moreira is saying Valeria Chomsky just called him to say that those rumors are a lie and fake news, and urging anyone who spread it to retract it. Huh. Okay, that's interesting. So Valeria Chomsky just called him to say these rumors are a lie and fake news, and urging anyone who spread it to retract it. All right. Well, let's hope that's true. That would be wonderful. Let's see if there's what there is going on at the Rumble page. And then Takfiri says, I believe Chomsky lost it in his old age, calling for Biden to lock up Americans who did not take the vaccine to internment camps. Yeah, he was. Yeah, I mean, I didn't like some of the positions he took, in particularly on the vax and so on, and he also got in on the whole climate change hoax, which he took very seriously, which I was also rather disappointing. But you have to set that against his positive contributions. All right, let's see on this page what we have here. Okay, so let's see. Hugh Keenan says, To Kill a Nation by Michael Parenti. Your thoughts? That's a good book. That's a very good book. That was one of the early books on the war on Yugoslavia. It's written with great fire, great passion, and I have nothing but good things to say um, about it. There's a very interesting. I actually rather like Parenti. Um, there's a video on YouTube which I've always thought was really with Parenti, which is really interesting. Um, and this has to have been early 90s when he gave this talk, and he was talking about how the left is always attacking the Soviet Union. Um, and he said, well, it's very, very strange that the left keeps attacking, the one place where the revolution was actually a success. I mean, it's like the left always wants to embrace revolutions that fail. But in the Soviet Union, they succeeded. There was a small number of the Bolsheviks. They seized power. They defeated their adversaries. They fought a brutal civil war. They managed to prevail in the civil war. They faced a foreign intervention. They managed to face off the foreign intervention. Then, all crisis after crisis, wars, and everything else. He said, that's a successful revolution. Why is the left continually attacking the Soviet Union? And then he said the same thing about Cuba. I mean, again, the left's always attacking Cuba, but Cuba, again, was a success. They did it. Now, if you're not a leftist, then you can say, well, I don't like the Soviet Union because I don't like communism, and so on, and that's fair enough. You could definitely not like communism and the authoritarian systems, and enforced egalitarianism and so on. And there's a lot of reasons not to like communism. But if you're on the left, then it's very strange why you would attack somebody who actually succeeded, actually got the job done. And it's a very it's just a very interesting, and that's why he said, there's something about the left, the mentality of the left. They always embrace failure. They always, want, oh, this revolution failed. Oh, wonderful, so they embrace someone like Guevara, who failed, rather than Castro, who succeeded. And absolutely hate Stalin, absolutely hate Mao. The people who actually succeeded actually got the job done. So it's somewhere on YouTube, and you can get it. It's a very entertaining lecture. So anyway, that book, To Kill a Nation, is a good book. Yeah, and it was written very, very, very soon after the bombing of Yugoslavia, and it was a good book. Dan Rock says, I agree with your sentiments about Chomsky. I too was at odds with his vaccine and climate stance, but like you say, he had a lot of positives, especially at the time of the Buckley interview and his stance on Central America. I absolutely. I think, stance on Central America, and again the Middle East. I think one of his best books was the book that he wrote on Israel. I think it was called the Fateful Triangle: Israel, the United States. I don't know, whatever. Israel, the United States, and something or other. And he wrote that following the Israel's invasion of Lebanon, but he went in, dealt with the whole history of Israel-U.S. relations. It was a very good book. It was a very detailed, as a historical account, and then you talked about the '67 war and everything else. So I think it was a very, he did a lot of very good work, and the stuff that he did about the Khmer Rouge. People have misunderstood. He never defended the Khmer Rouge, and he never minimized the what the Khmer Rouge did. I mean, there were several levels of his critique. I mean, first of all, he says you can't take out of context, what the Khmer Rouge did with what actually was going on in that war in Cambodia, that whole brutal war that was waged by the United States in Cambodia. I mean, Khmer Rouge responded to that. But then he also said that the stories that were being put about after the Khmer Rouge takeover in 1975 were really based on nothing. It was that guy. I think it was Jean Le Couture. Maybe I'm wrong. No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't Jean Le Couture. Or maybe it was. It was something like Cambodia Year Zero. Somebody who wrote that. No, I can't remember the guy's name who wrote that book, Cambodia Year Zero. And he said, well, he didn't have any evidence. He just said, he made these wild claims about how many people the Khmer Rouge killed. And then everybody accepted that as true. And then people just started repeating it. That somehow the Khmer Rouge decimated a third of its population or something. And they said, well, there was never any basis for that. And so he was saying about how, we always minimize when the casualties inflicted by our side. We're always very skeptical. I got to be careful. I got to be careful here. Got to be careful. But when it comes to casualty numbers of the others, then we just ready accept them. And that was what he was saying. So, but this immediately was repeated. Chomsky is defending the Khmer Rouge. Which is absolute nonsense. He never defended the Khmer Rouge, and he never defended any communists. I mean, that's the thing. He never defended the communists. I mean, he just said, correctly, there's a kind of a symmetry between that, that world and our world, and he actually. There's the intolerance for dissident opinions. There's a similarity. You could say that's a facile argument, but I don't think it was facile, but people hated it. And but that debate with Buckley it was particularly instructive. I don't know what Buckley thought he was doing by trying to challenge Chomsky, but he was hopelessly in over his head. And then Buckley started doing something really annoying, which is he started making faces. I always hated when people make faces, but he started, Buckley always did that, making faces. And he started making faces at Chomsky, like, lifting up his eyebrows and, opening his eyes wide and so on. And I think that just annoyed Chomsky no end. And then Chomsky described, years later, I think at the time when Buckley died, and Chomsky was asked, what's your view of Buckley? And he said, well, I always heard that Buckley was this great debater, but when I had my debate with him, I certainly didn't think he was a great debater. And then he said that after the recording, he said that, oh, we're going to have you back on, definitely, I'm going to, my assistant is going to, I think, no, in those days they said secretary. They didn't say assistant. My secretary will get in touch with you and we'll set up another debate. And says, I never heard from him again. There was never another debate. So I think Buckley had enough. Anyway, so the let me see. Go back a little bit. It's very hard, I know if you say, oh, it's something, but it's very hard to read white lettering against a black background. Anyway, okay. So Richard Phillips says, I thought it was a defensive alliance. Montenegro is no use at all, just a liability. Yep, exactly. Rupert Fellows says, thank God the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine went back to Russia, who would all be dead. Good, very good point. That's a very, very good point. Yeah. And Guni 1972 says, I wonder if the EU is just a continuation of the Marshall Plan. If so, why did the Trilateral Commission not sign the paper that Peace Summit came up with? I mean, the EU would have no clue without them. No, I mean the Americans, of course, always supported the EU because they thought it's just it would turn out to be an effective way of organizing and mobilizing Europe for NATO, for the American military effort. And of course, that's what it turned out to be. So for a while during the Cold War, the NATO and the EU were kind of separate entities, which didn't really please the Americans that much. But as it turned out, the EU is just now just it's there to keep the NATO mobilized. Anyway. Victor, it says 4411825. Victor Orban is a super Zionist, and everything he says should be looked at with suspicion. Yeah, but the Zionist thing, as we were saying the other day on with Peter, it's a very interesting phenomenon of these right-wing kind of parties in Europe, which are so ardently pro-Israel. The right in Europe had traditionally not been particularly philo-Semitic, not been particularly pro-Israeli. That has changed. And I don't know exactly what their motivation is. I mean, you can come up with 10 different reasons, but none of them ever seems particularly compelling. So, but whether it's Orban or whether it's Nigel Farage, whether it's Geert Wilders, they're all extraordinarily, passionately committed to Israel. And whether it's their opposition to the Muslims, or whether that's what it is, or whether it's the other way around, it was their Zionism that leads to the opposition to the Muslims. I don't know, but they're all ready. And this guy in Britain, this ruffian Tommy Robinson, he's another one, absolutely crazily Zionist. It says Orban just demonstrate that right-wing populism is no solution to the contradictions of the day. Well, I think we're probably going to find that out. I think within the next 2-3 years, I think we're going to find out that Maloney failed. I suspect the National Rally will fail. And we'll have to think about something else. But at the moment, it's looking like the answer is right-wing populism, even though it's clear that it's not really succeeding. And again, even with Trump, you can see that Trump seems to have abandoned. He used to have a kind of a populist economic message, and while he still has that about trade and so on, he doesn't attack corporations anymore. Remember, back in 2016, he used to go after the corporations about how they were offshoring jobs and how they were betraying American workers, and they were hiring immigrant labor. He used to attack corporations. That's all gone. He doesn't do that anymore. Anyway. And then it says, Orban's job is to steer the discontent on the right in the safe, pro-elitist, pro-white nationalist direction with a lot of empty, hot air. I think it's... I don't know about white nationalists. I'm not sure that's exactly how I would frame it. But I do think that, these people, these kind of right-wing populists like Orban, they move everything into this very safe, banal issue, which is like families and children. Okay, well, I'm for children. I'm for families. Work, it's a work culture. Okay, I'm for work. I mean, it's... What does any of that mean? Anyway, So reality checks, why is nobody talking about the end of the petrodollar? MBS has refused to renew the petrodollar contract with the US. Well, we talked about that. I think there's less to that than meets the eye. I mean, the issue isn't really, how you conduct your transactions. I mean, Saudi Arabia said already some time ago that it will accept yuan as payment for its oil. I don't think that's really the issue. The issue is what would really hurt the dollar is if you no longer held your foreign currency reserves, or all of your reserves in dollars, and if your currency was no longer pegged to the dollar. But the Saudi riyal is pegged to the dollar, and Saudi Arabia holds its assets in dollars. It buys a lot of treasuries and it holds them in dollars. So the fact that it's accepting payment other than in dollars, I don't think it's really shaking up the system. Richard Phillips, you're Hungarian and you think he's full of it, basically. Well, he's yeah, I mean, it gets a little tiresome after a while. I mean, it's like, always marching up the hill and then, all right, let's march down again. We made our point. We almost got to the top of the hill. Let's call it off. Yeah, but are most politicians full of it? Yeah, maybe. Yeah, you're probably right. He's no worse than others. But the problem is, if that's going to be your standard, he's no worse than others, then that may not be enough to go on winning elections, because then somebody's going to say, well, we can get rid of him, and then we can get somebody else, and he's not going to have all this baggage. He's going to get on well in Brussels. He's going to go to Ursula von der Leyen, and he's going to be in favor. And suddenly Hungary gets his 20 billion euros back. So what do we need him for? I mean, if he's not going to stand up on matters of principle, then what do we need him for? Hugh Keenan said, George, you'll beat Scotland. Cheer up. It's possible. I just don't think it's going to be enough to get Hungary over the finish line. I don't think Hungary is going to get into the next round. Sad. The Incompletist says, Ferenc Puskás, a name that resonates through the eon. Yeah, it's very interesting because, if you think of Hungary, the post-1945 Hungary, I mean, what do most people know about post-1945 Hungary? The great Hungarian football team, the Puskás team. But the irony of it is that the Puskás team, its heyday was under the most brutal Stalinist regime, the Rákosi regime. It was the early 1950s when Hungary was run by Matyas Rákosi. So it's kind of interesting that was its the thing that most people know about. I mean, the stuff that happened before World War II. I mean, that people don't know much about that. But since World War II, that's what people know about. Puskás and the great Hungarian team. And that was under Rákosi. And there's a certain parallel there with Russia, where you sort of think, yeah, but when there was the Soviet Union, they used to be able to know, they used to know how to do things. They could go, boom, they'd go into Hungary, they would remove the regime of Imre Nagy, install their man Kadar, and then everything was solved. They knew how to do it. They knew how to organize coups. They don't know how to do it anymore. I mean, I was reading the other day about their intervention in Afghanistan in December 1979, though, it wasn't a huge success, as it turned out, for the Soviet Union, but they did it well. They executed it perfectly. The way they moved in with just a few paratroopers, they seized Kabul, they seized the presidential palace, they executed the man they wanted executed, Amin, the president of Afghanistan. They installed their guy, Babrak Karmal. And, then, of course, things became more problematic. But the point is that they knew what to do in 1979. How do you take over a country like Afghanistan, again, with just a handful of people, which is what they did? Russia just doesn't really know how to do it. So it's like, Hungary knew how to play football then. I mean, ever since the Rákosi era, Hungary hasn't been able to produce, a halfway decent football team. Anyway, let's see. All right. Blake Edwards, Hugh Keenan says, Blake Edwards said Sellers was insane. Yeah. Tracy Wilkinson says Lady Killers was another great British film. You're absolutely right. That's one of the greats, truly one of the great films of all time. I think it's one, has to be considered as, one of the great, not just one of the great comedies of all time, but one of the great films of all time. Incidentally, the guy who directed The Lady Killers was the guy who then came to the United States and directed The Sweet Smell of Success, which is also an outstanding film, but it's a very American film. It's New York and everything. So it's just interesting that this director was able to do this, kind of very British, kind of creepily British film, The Lady Killers, and then he did that very energetic, edgy American film, The Sweet Smell of Success. Hugh Keenan, Sweet Old Lady, yeah. Virgo Rising says, buying books at a King's Road shoe store, I saw across the room Peter Sellers and Britt Eklund seated, waiting to be served, trying to look inconspicuous. Peter looked sick and Britt looked victorious. Yeah, that's what I mean. That's, Sellers was kind of, I think he married Britt Eklund, but he was always going after these really beautiful young women. I think he had that, that kind of insecurity about himself. Again, he's just a Jewish Cockney boy, obviously very talented. So, but he said, hey, now that I'm a success, I want the most beautiful babes in the world. Yeah. Tracy Wilkinson says, Alistair Sim in Green for Danger and Cottage to Let with George Cole. Sim, one of the finest actors of his time. Yeah, I liked him too. Yeah, those were pretty decent films. Coop says, George, did you see the most recent Lady Babylon? I don't even know what Lady Babylon is, to be honest. Goonie 97 says, even Trump looks like a baby balloon on the side of Vucic. But but he always Vucic again looks lugubrious. You remember that meeting when Vucic was in the Oval Office? That was when Trump kind of secured some kind of an agreement, an economic agreement between Serbia and Kosovo, and Vucic just sat there, again, head hanging down, and then the Russian woman Zaharova, she sent out a tweet making fun of Vucic for the way he was sitting. He said, "Oh, he's like Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct." I didn't fully get what he meant. I mean, what she meant, rather, that he was sitting. He was taking the position of Sharon Stone in Basic Instinct. It didn't. I didn't get the joke. But because I didn't see the connection between the way what Sharon Stone did in Basic Instinct with Vucic's kind of posture in that meeting with Trump in the Oval Office. But the Serbs were very unhappy about Zaharova's tweet. They didn't like their president being likened to Sharon Stone. in Basic Instinct. So the Russian government apologized. Sorry, not sorry. So anyway. Okay, Stone River, thank you. Dan Rock says the Western left is the failed left. That's why they attack the successful left. On another point, what are your views on Stoltenberg's senior? Someone you must know extensively well due to his involvement in Yugoslavia. I don't think they are related. I mean, it's the same name, but then they're not related. There was the Stoltenberg, who had been the representative of the United Nations. So there was this dual attempt to bring peace to Yugoslavia, in which David Owen was the representative of the European Union. And then you had Cyrus Vance, who had been the representative of the United Nations. So that gave us the Vance-Owen plan, which was a dud. But then Cyrus Vance was replaced by Stoltenberg. And then there was the Owen-Stoltenberg plan, which was actually among the best of the plans for Bosnia and Herzegovina, because it actually, in effect, divided up Bosnia and Herzegovina into 3 cantons. But the Muslims were absolutely determined not to accept it. So, my view is that Stoltenberg was, I think, a much better person than this Stoltenberg, but they're not related. So that was okay, because, as I say, the Owen Owen was a total jerk. I have nothing but contempt for Owen. But I think, but this plan, this Owen-Stoltenberg plan, was, probably the best of all the plans for Bosnia and Herzegovina, which of course is why the Americans were dead set against it, and of course the Muslims were never going to accept it. Anyway. DJ 5314 says about Chomsky, the best thing he did was to help bring us Norman Finkelstein. No, that's an interesting point. Finkelstein was indeed Chomsky's protege, and it's kind of interesting because the way Finkelstein tells the story, I think Chomsky told him, if you want a successful academic career, I'd knock it off. I wouldn't go down this path. I wouldn't take this interest in Israel, because that's going to destroy you. But Finkelstein, he carved out his own path. He carved out his own destiny. But yeah, his career was indeed destroyed. Hugh Keenan says, Andrei Vilcek and Chomsky book on Western terrorism. Chomsky was very hit and miss overall. I think that's fair. He's done some good work. I thought the one he did on Yugoslavia was only okay. Wasn't that great. I think he got a lot of things wrong. I actually liked his colleague, his erstwhile colleague Edward Herman, much more than Chomsky. Herman was much more solid than Chomsky, and Herman, I think, did a lot of the work. But Herman was very modest. He never really wanted the credit. He was happy for Chomsky to take the credit, and particularly the famous formulation, manufacturing consent. That was Herman. Herman came up with that phrase. I mean, yeah, they took it from Walter Lippmann, but that they called that book, the famous book, Manufacturing Consent, and that's the role of the media. The media is there to manufacture consent for what government does. And that Ed Herman came up with that phrase. but Chomsky, it's always credited to Chomsky. Oh, Chomsky came up with manufacturing. It's always given to Chomsky, and and Herman was quite happy. He never sought the limelight. He never tried to think, hey, I came up. It's my phrase, manufacturing consent. So he allowed Chomsky to go with it. Tuck Fury says Buckley was a conservative controlled opposition, just like Ben Shapiro. Yeah, I think so. In fact, William Buckley opened the doors for Shapiro's of the world. Yeah, I think so too. I think so. I think that's kind of what Buckley did. So Orban against Soros, but pro Netanyahu. Don't think so. Yeah, there's no love lost between Soros and Netanyahu. Soros has never been. We talked about it before, but Soros has never been a big fan of Israel. So So there's always been that almost like a Orban and Netanyahu would gang up against Soros. So I mean, I know Soros has always identified with, particularly his defenders. Oh, he's a Jew. You're only attacking him because he was a Jew, and so on. But basically, Soros has never taken much of an interest in Jewish things, and certainly he's never been much of a fan of Israel. I mean, Soros did a lot of very bad things, but he's never been a huge fan of Israel. Dan Rock says, "What do you think of Sarah Wagenknecht?" She's the new German left opposition leader. We'll see. I mean, she did quite well in these European elections, but we'll see whether she can build on that. But it's going to be hard because if no one will form a coalition with you, then you're permanently isolated. And that's kind of what happened with the left in Germany. The German left, which was Oscar Lafontaine and Gregor Gysi. No one would form any coalition with them, so they were always kind of this party that's always out of power. So we'll see whether that works. Hugh Keenan says George Lukács's book, The Destruction of Reason, Made by Brain. That's Lukács's worst book. Now Lukács, all right, that's a huge subject, but Lukács wrote many very, very bad books. But of all the bad books that Lukács wrote, The Destruction of Reason was probably his worst. It really was a hack job that he wrote really at the height of Rákosi's Hungary, early 1950s, and he particularly was attacking the kind of the Marxists, the Western Marxists, and especially like the Frankfurt School and so on. But that's a book we can talk about another time. Marquez says, always enjoy these live stream with George. Cannot understand why not 100,000 plus subscribers. I can't understand it either. I don't get it. And it's very, very annoying. I'm very happy with the people we have. I really appreciate all of you who joined me. But why we don't get more? I don't know. I mean, if you can spread the word, wherever you are, bring in, an additional 2-3 people. That'd be, that would be good. Really would appreciate it. Anyway, my time is up, and I think I have to do an interview now. I think about Orban. I think I'm gonna really dump on Orban. I think it's for RT, and I'm gonna dump on Orban what I was saying here. So anyway, thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed it. Really appreciate your generosity and your time and the contributions. And we will be back on Thursday. Stone River says the gaggle, the world's best kept secret. Yeah, that's a nice way of a double-edged compliment, shall we say? Best kept secret. But you're absolutely right. Anyway, thank you everybody so much. We'll be back Thursday, same time. Good night. All the best. See you then. Bye-bye.